There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has three dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games. One must first answer. That is the opening to The Myth of Sisyphus, written by Albert Camus. And that's one of the best openings ever of all philosophy. Any philosophical writing, that has to be one of the best openings ever. It's a bold statement, but I think it is true. And easy way to realize that it's true is by watching the first Pokemon movie, because in the first Pokemon movie you have a intelligent life form, and he basically just exists one day, and he just immediately starts asking philosophical questions. And then when you think about all the other metaphysical questions, like does reality or does the mind have like 6 or 12 categories? It does kind of make sense that it comes afterwards. Like whether like figuring out whether life is even worth living is like that's like the prerequisite to everything. And then a few pages later, he says, the subject of this essay is precisely the relationship between the absurd and suicide, the exact degree to which suicide is a solution to the absurd. The principle can be established that for a man who does not cheat, what he believes to be true must determine his action. Belief in the absurdity of existence must then dictate his conduct. And that is like the point of this essay. Like throughout this entire essay, a character or an archetype of the is just called the absurd man, and it's referenced throughout this entire story, and it's a person that embodies the absurd to the fullest extent. But I will get to that later. One of my favorite sections in this entire book is at the beginning, and it's called Absurd Walls. And in the Absurd Walls, it talks about like I think it's referencing like deconstructing or seeing past the walls of society, of reality. And this is probably when he starts to talk about lucidity, because that's a word that gets talked about a lot in this book. And it's lucidity as in seeing clearly throughout like reality, I guess. Like the absurd man embodies lucidity of his life. Like he's not hiding anything. He doesn't have any hope for anything, any other life that to live. All he has is this life, and all he has is what he has, which is a great way to live your life. And put I gave each paragraph a number and like a word, like deconstructing the absurd walls. And it starts by great works are often born on a street corner or in a restaurant's revolving door. So it is with absurdity. And I took this as you just understand you have lucidity in your daily life. Like it just happens, or you see it in the shit you do every day. And this is not just a absurd thing. This is just a thing of philosophy. Like I probably talked about this in my Nietzsche book video, but all philosophy, what I love that it does is that it puts into words things that people deal with on a daily basis, like reality and what metaphysics does, or ontology or epistemology. Just this is just like shit you deal with every single day, but actually putting it into words is the profound part. And a really good part is he's talking about time, and he's talking about one day he turns 30. Thus, he asserts his youth. By simultaneously, he situates himself in relation to time. He takes his place in it. He demands that he stands at a certain point on a curve that he acknowledges having to travel to its end. He belongs to time, and the horror that seizes him, he recognizes his worst enemy, tomorrow. He was longing for tomorrow, whereas everything in him ought to reject it. That revolt of the flesh is the absurd. in the section, the 4, it says that this revolt of the flesh is the absurd not as a definition, but as a feeling of the absurd. I guess the best way to understand the absurd walls is he says men too secrete the inhuman at certain moments of lucidity. The mechanical aspect of their gestures, the meaningless pantomime, makes silly everything that surrounds them. A man is talking on the phone behind a glass Patreon. You can hear him, but you see his incomprehensible dumb show. You wonder why he is alive. And this discomfort in the face of man's own inhumanity, this incalculable tumble before this image of what we are, this nausea, as a writer of today calls it, is also the absurd. And I think that's the best way to just understand the absurd is just everything. Like it's just the absurd of daily life and of just like everyone doing things like having kids is absurd, having getting all of it is like is absurd basically. All these like little things that like he says inhuman and like oh the big important businessman on the phone like oh gotta make the sale or some shit like it's just a dumb show like it I don't they get their panties in a bunch for over nothing, you know, over just some absurd dumb bullshit, you know. And that's kind of what I get out of that. Then he says, this world in itself is not reasonable. That is all that can be said. But what is absurd is the confrontation of this irrational and the wild longing for clarity whose call echoes in the human heart. Now, he kind of describes like how it's not reasonable. That kind of makes me think how it's absurd. But then he says what is actually absurd is the confrontation of the irrational and the wild longing for clarity whose call echoes in the human heart. So I guess trying to understand the irrational is more absurd than the absurd or whatever. But maybe just that like man has no choice but to be absurd because he can't understand the irrational, which is already absurd. So it's all just absurd. And then for philosophical suicide, he basically just like goes down each existentialist philosopher. Like he says Jasper and Chestov and Kierkegaard and Heidegger. And I liked Heidegger, I think, the most. He doesn't, I mean, Heidegger, um, like the way Camus talked about it, it talks about the absurd, but what's more profound is that like he talks about anxiety and he talks about how like anxiety conscious of death, but maybe also conscious of the absurd. And it just has like a underlying like thing with like being alive with like reality. And he says, but if fear becomes conscious of itself, it becomes anguish, the perpetual climate of the lucid man, in whom existence is concentrated. So it's just the whole thing of like lucidity. And that's like kind of what I agree with too, because like you're like aware of it. Like there's like a level of awareness to anxiety. But I don't know too much about Heidegger. In the beginning of the book, he said that like the whole point of this book is an essay linking absurd and suicide, but I didn't. After philosophical suicide, he kind of doesn't really talk about suicide anymore. Like this book, like come if you watch YouTube or whatever about this book, it's like, oh, this is a book about suicide. This isn't really a book about suicide. This is just a philosophy book. And they talk about suicide in the beginning of it and literally only in the beginning of it. This is like not a book about suicide. It just isn't. Well, yeah, I mean the podcast, the Alex O'Connor podcast with the myth with Sisyphus 55. I'm going to reference it again, but it basically said that like this is not a book to cure your society to a suicide. It's a book to like make you manage it, make you live with it better. And like that is true. And that's like more of what the book is about, is just how to live your life basically. But a good ending note for all this suicide stuff is that all man has is his lucidity and his definite knowledge of the walls surrounding him. All these experiences agree and confirm one another. The mind, when it reaches its limits, make a judgment and choose its conclusions. This is where suicide and reply stand. So I mean, at the end of the day, like suicide is just basically a decision. Oh, what the heck? Oh well, all of that part wasn't actually the philosophical suicide, but that was actually all absurd walls. But I thought when he talks about all the other philosophers, it's philosophical suicide. But I mean, he what he means by philosophical suicide is just it's like existentialism is a way of committing philosophical suicide, as in that like you're thinking that the whole point of existentialism is like creating your meaning, and he thinks that is a way of like philosophical suicide of by creating meaning. Oh, that's a way of hope. You know, I think creating your own meaning is like hoping to achieve something. But he's saying that's not it. He's saying that does not go with absurdity. Oh, and then he says something cool. He says the absurd is not in man nor in the world, but in their presence together. And now he talks about this thing in philosophical, I'm pretty sure this, yeah, in philosophical suicide, this is when he starts to talk about the leap. And the leap is that inability to understand, which becomes the existence that illuminates everything. And he just constantly talks about the leap, like throughout the later, like throughout, like beyond this point. And he's just, the leap, the leap, the leap. And I always came back to it, like, what do you mean by that? I guess that's kind of, I don't know if it's like a Taoist or like a Buddhist way of looking at things, but like not understanding becomes like the first step into understanding, kind of. Or maybe not even understanding, but like accepting that you can't understand is the first step. Oh. And I think when he talks about Kierkegaard, or he talks about God and he says, from a certain religious inspiration as from the rational order. No. He says they always lay claim to the eternal, and it is solely in this that they take the leap. And like the eternal is like something that they don't understand. So there's when they go into not understanding something, as in not understanding the internal, then that's when they like start. Or that's just how I think of it. And on the next page after that, he talks about like consciousness, and he talks about Bergson, as in Henry Bergson's image, and he says like consciousness focuses, and it resembles the projector that suddenly focuses on an image and shit. And I don't know, that he's not always talking about like absurdity and suicide and blah blah blah. But all right, now we get into the good stuff. Revolt. There's three concepts that he talks about, and revolt is the first one. Revolt is a constant confrontation between man and his own obscurities. And he says, just as danger provided man the unique opportunity of seizing awareness, so metaphysical revolt extends awareness to the whole of experience. And then he makes the link between like revolt and suicide, and like, well, isn't suicide revolt? But he says no. He says suicide, like the leap, is acceptance at its extreme. Then he says, it is essential to die unreconciled and not of one's own free will. And suicide is a repudiation, but I don't know. Later he talks about that like maybe it's better to die by your own hand, but I don't know. Either we are not free and God, the all powerful, is responsible for evil, or we are free and responsible, but God is not all powerful. and that's cool. But we'll talk about that later. And then for the second thing, second to revolt, he talks about conquest. And to summarize conquest, conquerors are merely those among men who are conscious enough of their strength to be sure of living constantly on those heights and fully aware of that grandeur. Before I get to the third and final concept, absurd creation, examples of absurd men or just absurd things is Don Juan, someone who like actually loves every woman that he spends the night with and not just like says that he loves it, but he like cuz he knows he has lucidity in what he's doing, but he like does it regardless. And that's the absurd part, is doing it regardless. Or he also says the actor is like an absurd person, and because like they have a limited time to live out this character, and they have to live a whole life in like an hour or some shit, and so they put everything into this 1 hour and then it's done and you never get it again. You put everything into this character regardless that it's about to be done. But he says conquest or play acting, multiple loves, absurd revolt are tributes that man pays to his dignity in a campaign in which he is defeated and advanced. And I think that's the important thing, is that he is defeated and advanced. That's like kind of the whole thing of absurdity, is that you just you're just kind of stuck on this rock and you kind of got nothing else to do. And I guess that's kind of what he means by defeated and advanced. You're just kind of fucked regardless, like if you're gonna die anyways. And then he says it is merely a matter of being faithful to the rule of the battle. I think that's just like, you do with what you got, you do with what the things that you have. And then he talks about Nietzsche. And Nietzsche, he said, we have art in order not to die of the truth. And that is like a whole, and I could see how that plays into the whole absurd thing and just making with what you got on planet Earth. And I don't know if I already talked about this, but he says, for the absurd man, it is not a matter of explaining and solving, but of experiencing and describing. Everything begins with lucid indifference. The main thing there is the experiencing and describing. I think that's like the whole point of it. And that makes sense because like that's the whole point of reality. I don't even know about like describing. Describing's whatever, but like experiencing, that's the whole point of everything. And if you're just focused on explaining and solving, then it's not gonna be fun. But to go back to the whole creation thing, and then he says, is a absurd work of art even possible? Yes. And I don't really know if I say yes because I read the book or if I just say this because of opinion, but he talks about this guy like Leger or Leger, or I don't fucking know, I don't know. But he's like a abstract painter, and he talks about it, he describes it as the one that tries to reduce reality to its essential elements. It is ultimately but a visual delight. All it has kept of the world is its color. And that's just kind of absurd. Like abstract art is all just kind of absurd because like there's no point in it, but it's still things to convey and provoke, and it still has, you just get it. Like words aren't good. Words aren't good for that, but you see it and you see it and you get it, if you even get it at all. But for absurd creation, does talk about like he talks about like fiction a lot, and like fiction and like fictional worlds, I think, but I don't know, he just talks about fiction. I don't exactly know what he's talking about with absurd creation, but he says the philosopher, even if he is Kant, is a creator. I guess one way to think of creator is like creating their universe. He says the writer has given up telling stories and creates his universe. I'm gonna have to come back to this part. I need to read the fucking trials part, but okay. Here's like one of my favorite part of this book is the Kirillov section. And he talks a lot about, and this is going to be spoilers for that Dostoevsky book about the three brothers, but I mean, it doesn't really matter. He says Jesus at his death did not find himself in paradise. He found out then that his torture had been useless. And that makes me think of the Chop Suey, yeah, the Chop Suey song of Father, why have you forsaken me and all that shit. Which I guess that makes sense now. I don't know. I didn't read the fucking Bible, but then he says he found out that his torture had been useless. So the have you forsaken me part. The law of nature, he says, the engineer made Christ live in the midst of falsehood and die for a falsehood. Solely in this sense, Jesus indeed personifies the whole human drama. And that sounds like the absurd. He is the complete man, being the one who realized the most absurd condition. Oh, yeah, there. He is not the God man, but the man God. Yeah, that part, I really like that part. Then he says, Kirillov in the book says, if God does not exist, I am God. And that's the whole thing, because then, and this is, he also says this with Nietzsche too. He says, to become God is merely to be free on this earth, not to serve an immortal being. If God exists, all depend on him and we can do nothing against his will. If he does not exist, everything depends on us. And that goes back to what I said earlier, or what he wrote earlier. And then for Kirillov, as for Nietzsche, to kill God is to become God oneself. It is to realize on this earth the eternal life of which the gospel speaks. And then at the bottom of the book, there's a little number to make sense of it, and it says Starovgin. Do you believe, he's talking to someone, he says, do you believe in the eternal life of the other world? Kirillov says, no, but in the eternal life in this world. And that's the whole point of it all. And then he understands that and shit, but Kirillov is still set on killing himself. The reasoning though is he says, am unhappy because I am obliged to assert my freedom. But the whole reason for that is that this is an example of a absurd work of art. Because Camus in this book, he says that Dostoevsky is a absurd. No, he is a artist, not a philosopher, and this is an absurd work of art. So this is what he means by that. And then he says at the end of the book, or at the end of his arc, Kirillov's arc, says, and then he says all that crazy shit that he just talked about. Then he says at the end of it, he says, all is well. And there's like some other good shit in this book and whatever that I just recommend you all read it for yourself. But then here we go. Page 119, The Myth of Sisyphus. And this is like basically the whole book. This is basically like the only part of, not like the only part of the book that matters, but like, I mean, it's the title of the book. Whatever. It's not, wait, how many pages, bro? This is only like, yeah, it's only like 5 pages. But now it's time to talk about Sisyphus. And in the Sisyphus part, he's like, Camus says Sisyphus is, he scorns gods, he scorns the god, he hates death, and his passion for life won him that unspeakable penalty in which the whole being is exerted toward accomplishing nothing. But the whole significance of Sisyphus for Camus is that it's it's not just the love of life, which is a whole big thing, which I'll get into later of Amor Fati, but it's not just the pushing of the rock. Sisyphus, he was condemned by the gods to push the rock up the hill in Hades for the rest of eternity because he tricked the gods too much and shit. So it's his punishment. But that's everything, you know. That's everything we just talked about. That's I said it earlier. It's like it's basically that like this is enough, and that's the whole point of absurdity. And for Sisyphus, pushing up the rock is like that is like enough. And the significant, I guess, arc in Sisyphus's path is right when he pushes the rock all the way up the hill and he pushes it down the other end of the hill. It's the moment of turning back. It's the returning to to doing it all over again. That's the whole point of it. Oh, yeah, and the whole point on why Camus likes the return to the rock so much is that that's the moment of lucidity. Camus or the whole thing with Sisyphus is not that like Sisyphus found happiness, like he found happiness or he has hope, or is that he's looking for something when pushing up the rock, or that he's found something when he pushes the rock. But it's none of that. It's the actual act of pushing up the rock itself. And he gets the most lucidity in that during the turn down back to the base of the mountain to do it all over again. Then Camus says, if this myth is tragic, that is because its hero is conscious. Where would his torture be indeed if at every step the hope of succeeding upheld him? The workman of today works every day in his life at the same tasks, and this fate is no less absurd. But it is tragic only at the rare moments when it becomes conscious. Sisyphus, proletarian of the gods, powerless and rebellious, knows the whole extent of his wretched condition. It is what he thinks of during his descent. The lucidity that was to constitute his torture at the same time crowns his victory. There is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. If the descent is thus sometimes performed in sorrow, it can also take place in joy. And then later, Camus says, happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same earth. And I'm just going to read the last page because it's like my favorite page of all time. All Sisyphus's silent joy is contained therein. His fate belongs to him. His rock is his thing. Likewise, the absurd man, when he contemplates his torture, silences all the idols. In the universe suddenly restored to its silence, the myriad wondering little voices of the earth rise up. Unconscious secret calls, invitations from all the faces. They are all they are the necessary reverse and price of victory. There is no sun without shadow, and it is essential to know the night. The absurd man says yes, and his efforts will henceforth be unceasing. If there is a personal fate, there is no higher destiny, or at least there is but one which he concludes is inevitable and despicable. For the rest, he knows himself to be the master of his days. At that subtle moment when he glances back overward, when he glances backward over his life, Sisyphus returning toward his rock, in that slight pivoting, he contemplates that series of unrelated actions which becomes his fate, created by him, combined under his memory's eye, and soon sealed by his death. Thus convinced of the wholly human origin of all that is human, a blind man eager to see, who knows that the night has no end. He is still on the go. The rock is still rolling. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burdens again, but Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe henceforth, without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Woo! Ooh! Fuck! That's so good. Let me read that again. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Ooh, that's a good book. And then the only thing after that is the appendix, which I have not read because I didn't like how I got spoiled on the other Kirillov book, and I don't really want to get spoiled on a Kafka book, but I want to read the appendix, which is also like, I don't know, like 7 pages. Oh, it's like 13 pages, but I don't know. I wanted to read it to understand the creations, the fictional creations section of this book more, because that part didn't really make sense, or at least I don't really remember that much from it. But now I have 2 other things outside of this book that I learned that to talk about. Okay. So in that Sisyphus 55 and Alex O'Connor podcast, a big misconception that people get with this book, and I guess with absurdity, is that like Sisyphus finds happiness from pushing the rock, or from some idea of happiness of pushing the rock. Like there's like some goal into pushing the rock, like a daily workout, or I don't fucking know. But like that's not it. That's philosophical suicide. That's just normal existentialism of finding meaning in, or creating meaning in life. And that's not what this book is. This is absurd. This is like kind of like, I don't know, doomer, if that's like the right word. This is like, it's like more like it's hopeless. Yeah, like it's just completely hopeless. But like there's, I guess, solace. Yeah, there's solace in it. Or no, no, maybe not even solace in it, but it's just enough. Like there's enough in the hopelessness. So it's like, I'm chilling, you know. But then also, so to kind of bounce off of the whole creating your own meaning and existentialism, is the absurd man, and Nietzsche is referenced a lot. And so you're thinking, oh, absurd man, amor fati. Oh, wait, that's like the Ubermensch. That's exactly like what Nietzsche was saying. But, and like there definitely is a parallel like of amor fati and existentialism. But I read a Reddit about it, and they're pretty different. And the whole thing on why they're different is yeah, like the Ubermensch creates meaning, but absurd man doesn't create the meaning. Mm, yeah, they're just different. Like they're similar, and it's cool to have a little thing, but they're just different. But yeah, I highly recommend that book. I don't know, that book was like a little weird. Like I don't know if it was like me not paying attention, but when I would read that book, he would just like be talking about like some random shit, and I'm just like I would like get it. Like I would get one paragraph, and then the other paragraph would be talking about like something completely different, but not in the way that Twilight of the Idols, which I made a YouTube video about, was like. Because Twilight of the Idols would talk like, okay, one paragraph we're talking about Napoleon and how he's a criminal, and then the next paragraph we're critiquing the Germany's Reichs, and the next paragraph we're fucking talking about Dionysus and Napoleon, and but this book doesn't do it like that. This book is like a chapter basically, like like absurd walls, and then philosophical suicide and revolt and conqueror and whatever, and it's like, oh, I don't get it. And he just like goes on and on and on about like the shit that like he just says so much shit about anything, about like about all the shit he's talking about, and then like he goes on and on about Conqueror, and it's like what Conqueror? Like just fucking say a little fucking paragraph describing what Conqueror is and give an example and then move on. Like he says so much shit and it's like too much about what you're talking about. Like, oh my god, I kind of struggled with it. Like I literally said it in this video, but I highlighted what he says about the Conqueror. And like it's like, do you actually mean conqueror, or are you just fucking using the word conqueror and you're just giving it some different meaning? But he's not giving it some different meaning. He's just using a million unnecessary words talking about whatever the fuck about conqueror. But I don't know. Maybe it's just a me thing. Maybe I just don't have the attention span, or I don't know. Whatever. It's a really, really good book. Anyways, I'll give it like 4 out of 5. If we're on Letterboxd, I'll give it 4 out of 5 with the heart. I can't give it a 5 out of 5, but 4 out of 5 with the heart. Amazing book. Now I can't wait to read The Stranger. Oh, The Stranger. Oh, here we go. Video coming soon, bro. I'll fucking read that shit in a day. I'm itching for some fiction.